Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed. Today, we're going to have an excellent episode because we're going to have our good friend Nick Redfern back on the show talking about his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. Let me tell you a little bit about Nick. Originally from England, Nick Redfern is the author of many books on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, werewolves, the Loch Ness Monster, paranormal phenomena, conspiracy theories, psychic powers, and Hollywood scandals. Nick writes regularly for the newsstand publications and has appeared on countless television shows. Today we're going to be talking about his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, and his webpage is nickredfern.com. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, my good friend, Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick, how are you?
Hey, Rita. I'm doing good, thanks.
Well, nice having you on the show. I was just looking online for the last time that you were on, and I'm thinking, oh, my God, it's been an entire year. I don't know how that happened. Anyway. But it's all good. So this book is about close encounters of the fatal kind. And the subtitle is Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. Are you trying to say that there's been foul play when you dig into the UFO phenomena?
Well, yes, in simple terms. It's one of these situations where clearly, most people in ufology, there's been thousands and thousands since 47, and nothing's happened to them. So in other words, it's not like UFO researchers, investigators, witnesses are dropping like flies. But there are a number of suspicious cases. There's no doubt about that amongst, the regular deaths of just from old age for most researchers. But when somebody has got a little bit too close to the truth, there are a number of suspicious cases like that. And so that's what the book is a study of. People who got a little bit too close to the truth, may have been murdered, made to look like suicide or an accident. Other cases that seem to be more connected with the UFO phenomenon itself, where we've had missing pilots and aircraft pursuing UFOs and then to suddenly plummet into the ground. So it's sort of a combination of the two, really.
Cool. Well, we're going to be digging into this as we keep going forward. So let's start our exploration with probably the most well-known UFO event, Roswell. And I know that many of the witnesses to the event and its aftermath were threatened, but did any of these threats ever play out?
Well, we're not entirely sure if any of the threats played out, but certainly, and not at the time at least, but certainly there have been some unusual deaths associated with the Roswell crash. Now, for people who aren't aware, the crash itself occurred on a large ranch called the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico in July 47. Lincoln County is actually today, it's like a 2-hour drive from the town of Roswell. It's actually, the town itself actually has no connection to the crash beyond the fact that that was the nearest military base and the wreckage was taken back to the base. But, it literally is, like a 2-hour drive to get there from the town. And that's important for a reason that I'll come to now. The wreckage itself was first found and recovered by a man named Matt Brazel, who was a rancher who ran the Foster Ranch, this gigantic ranch in Lincoln County. And I went out there in 2010, and it's huge. It's like never ending. And he found all this wreckage strewn across the fields, which was described as like a type of foil, very lightweight. You could wad it up in your hands and it would bounce back to its original form without any marks or creases on it. Well, clearly realizing that this wasn't something normal, he contacted the local sheriff's office. They in turn contacted the military, and the military came out. Now, as I said, today it's like a 2-hour drive. Back then, it was hours and hours to get out there, and when you were out there, you were forced to stay out there overnight, because getting back up on the dirt roads was too treacherous. And there are rumours that in between the military having been called out and actually arriving, that Brazel sort of wandered around this entire crash site, and kind of like with an aeroplane crash, if it explodes in the air, different things come down at different sites. And reportedly, as well as this huge field of wreckage, there were a number of bodies scattered around the area, dead alien bodies sort of pulverized and starting to decompose. And the story is that at one point, at least, Brazel's son, Vern Brazel, was also with him. Vern was just like a young kid at the time, like 8 or 9, I think. But there have been a lot of rumours that he saw the bodies and it sort of really psychologically scarred him, put him into like a state of almost like post-traumatic stress, or if not full-blown post-traumatic stress. And he never reportedly got over this. And when he was about 16, 17, old enough to leave home, he left home immediately, never came back to New Mexico or Lincoln County, and actually blew his brains out in California when he was like 23. There's nothing suspicious in the sense of that he was murdered, but it is sort of possibly an example of an unusual death in relation to the crash. Now, a far more sinister one involves a woman named Miriam Bush. Miriam Bush was the executive secretary at the Roswell Military Hospital at the time of the events, and there have been a lot of stories about when the crash happened that the hospital played a significant role when the bodies were brought in. And much of this story surfaced in 1989 originally from a guy named Glenn Dennis. And Glenn Dennis was the mortician's assistant, at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in 47. And, back then it was just a small town. It's not that big today. And everybody knew him, And he got a call on one occasion, right around the time of the crash, asking if he got any caskets or coffins that were suitable for children or child size, and could they be hermetically sealed. And he realized that there was something weird going on, so he traveled out to the base, and because everybody knew him, they assumed he'd been called to the base to deal with the crash, not realizing he'd just gone of his own accord. And he ran into a nurse friend of his, or he said was a nurse, and she told him to get the hell out of here, otherwise, you're going to end up dead in the desert or whatever. But she basically told him the snippets of this story, how these weird little, sort of hideous little goblin-type bodies had been brought in, and she'd seen them, and just told him to leave. Now, Dennis didn't say anything about this, Glenn Dennis, for years. It was 1989 when he went public, and he wanted to protect the woman, and he said she was a nurse at the hospital, and he gave her the name of Naomi Self, which actually wasn't a real name, and it turns out she wasn't a nurse, but she was actually this woman named Miriam Bush, almost certainly, who was an executive secretary, as I said, at the hospital. Now, her family have since come forward to say that when she was like 25, when the crash happened, she told her mom and dad what she'd seen, and they begged them, not to say anything ever. And so that is what happened, that, she stayed quiet. But she descended into like a state of post-traumatic stress, not unlike Vern Brazel. She became a full-blown alcoholic, and, she saw men in black on every street corner, and was paranoid she was being watched. And with hindsight, she probably had a lot of justification. Well, not long after Glenn Dennis went public with his story about the nurse and what she knew, Miriam Bush got even more paranoid. She started telling the family that people were definitely watching her and following her. And she, on one occasion, towards the very end of 1989, she booked into a hotel room, actually under her sister's name, using her sister's ID and address. And she was found dead in the room the next morning with a plastic bag on her head and bruises on her arms. So it didn't really sound like suicide. And the theory is that Miriam Bush was probably one of the last people who was highly credible and who people would have listened to had she blown the whistle and gone public. And I think what happened was that Glenn Dennis told his story, and that freaked out whoever realized that Miriam Bush was still alive and she had the ability to talk, but somebody got to her first, and that never happened. And I think that actually could well be a case of murder associated with the crash.
The bruises on her arms, do you know if they were inflicted, far prior to her dying, or do they think that they happened just prior to her committing suicide?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, the case is open, but the family have gone on record as stating that they felt the death was suspicious. There's actually, you can find footage online of the family being interviewed. Where it's not hearsay. It was a real death. It was investigated by the local police and the coroner, and they came to the conclusion it was suicide. But the family, partly because of the bruises and the odd way of killing yourself with a plastic bag on your head, but also because, if you're going to kill yourself, why book into a hotel room under somebody else's name? What difference is it going to make if you're going to end up dead? And the fact that, in the lead up to it, she got even more paranoid that people were watching her and following her. And this directly followed on from when Glenn Dennis actually pretty much outed her.
So do you think the Men in Black were following her? I mean, were the Men in... Let me ask the question first. I mean, this was, you said the 80s, correct?
It's a what, sorry?
She passed away in the 80s?
Hello?
Hello?
You broke up there. Hello?
You said that she passed away in the 1980s?
Well, what happened was Glenn Dennis went public with his story in September '89 about the nurse, who almost certainly was Miriam Bush, because her family said that she told what had happened, and and then she died in December '89. So she died 2 months or so, or was killed 2 months after Glenn Dennis told the story of the nurse, and then rumours started to surface. Well, she's actually still alive. Now, if whoever was hiding the truth of Roswell, didn't realise she was still alive, they may have come looking for her and started a hunt for her, after 40 years. And I think it's possible that she got hints that somebody was looking for her or had found her, and maybe they were following her, trying to intimidate her into silence. And but then when Glenn Dennis actually told the whole thing, then that may have been perceived as, well, if the press get to her first, this is a woman of major significance, the executive secretary at the base hospital. She's not like some Mr. X talking off the record. People would have listened to her, and that could well have been, she could have been one of the last few people who was on site, if you like, to see the bodies who, hadn't passed away from old age in '89.
And this might sound like a silly question, because you mentioned the Men in Black a couple of times. Were there reports, or have there been reports of Men in Black going back to the late 80s? Or is that a more new phenomena?
No, the Men in Black stories go back to the 40s. I'm not aware of anything to do with Miriam Bush where she said anything like she was being watched by, creepy men in black with fedoras and black suits. Nothing like that. It was just she was paranoid and suspicious that someone was watching her or looking for her. And, that's actually kind of quite plausible. If you think sort of 50 years ago an event happens and you don't realize somebody is still around to talk about it. Back in the 80s, before the internet and things like that, even for the government, it might have been, or whoever was involved, it may have been a challenge to try and find her. She using different names and traveling around and, living alone in this sort of little apartment and so forth. And so, she may have had justification, but there's nothing to sort of definitely, or anything at all to say that, she got visits from literal Men in Black. So.
Okay. It just is sad to hear a story like that of somebody that basically tries to live in obscurity because of a situation that they were exposed to.
Well, I think what this demonstrates is the way in which, for example, you have people who are exposed to traumatic events, and regardless of if they're murdered at a later point, it demonstrates possibly one of the reasons why there is UFO secrecy, because when you're sort of really exposed to the phenomenon at a close range, like bodies and so on, it may actually put someone into a complete state of shock. And, if that happened on a worldwide stage, I think that could be one of the factors that's been kind of, discussed and theorized as to why, we haven't been told the truth. Imagine 5 billion Miriam Bushes, all reacting in the same fashion, so to speak.
But I think today, in the 40s, there was only UFOs in the movies. There weren't any real ones. That was just your imagination. And to say to somebody, even today, people that are experiencers are challenged, that what their experience has been are fake or made up or they're hallucinating or whatever. But I think if someone said that, if we all were exposed to UFOs, if they landed on the White House lawn, or, like they say, I don't know that we would be that scared anymore because there's been so much knowledge and exposure.
I'm in kind of two minds, because the way we would respond or wouldn't respond, all we have right now is sort of theoretical ideas on how we would respond. People say, oh, well, the public wouldn't panic because everybody's watched the X-Files and Independence Day, and most people think this is all going on. And that's true. And I think, people may well not panic. But if tomorrow morning, we woke up and there were UFOs everywhere in the sky, and we're dealing with creatures that are so weirdly different to us, it's not just like saying, hey, take me to your leader, that they're just so beyond us. And you just see, thousands of ships hanging in the sky, then people might actually panic.
Well, yeah, that would be kind of threatening. I mean, even if we saw Russian ships hanging out in the sky, I think we'd all panic. And we know them.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, there is still grounds for a scenario in which sort of panic does break out. The problem is, we look at it today, and it's often dumbed down to this simplistic thing. Well, everybody's exposed to the UFO phenomenon, and so if it really happened, no one would be scared. That's kind of like saying everybody knows what a shark is, and you're not frightened of it until you get in the water, Then you are in big trouble and you are frightened. And I think it could be the same thing. Everybody knows what aliens supposedly look like, but that's very different to have one stood 4 feet in front of you coming towards you and you have nowhere to go.
Well, but even in that situation, you can't tell anybody. And if you told people, nobody would believe you anyway. So that just adds to the whole, isolation part of it.
Well, I think the other problem is, the phenomenon itself isn't actually helping the situation by staying in the dark as well. People always say, oh, well, why doesn't the government come clean and tell us? Well, you could make a good argument. Why don't the entities behind the phenomenon land and show themselves and let them explain what they're up to? They're not doing it any more than whoever's hiding the secret is, So that makes it doubly a problem, but also, it makes you wonder, well, why? Why are they not being totally open? I think there could be numerous reasons, really.
And it's all tied to the government and Eisenhower. I've heard it. Oh, wait, on this show. No.
Well, I actually, don't think the government are the guilty parties. I point out in the book, I don't think the CIA is running around killing UFO researchers or the NSA or the FBI or the government or Air Force intelligence. What I think is that probably somewhere around about the end of the Eisenhower era, I think the whole sort of UFO problem and the program and the wreckage and the bodies and everything else was sort of transferred over to what we might call like a shadow agency, one that operates outside of government, that gets its funding through so-called black budget means, that isn't overseen by Congress or the Senate, and for all intents and purposes doesn't exist, and most people in government know nothing about it. I'm perhaps one of the few people in the UFO community who doesn't think that when the Air Force put out its Roswell reports that they were lying. A lot of researchers said, well, they're lying, they're hiding the truth, and they're saying it's crash test dummies and mogul balloons and weather balloons. I don't think that was a lie. I think the Air Force went looking, couldn't find anything, because it was removed decades ago, but they still felt the responsibility was on their part to at least try and give it a good go and try and come up with an explanation. I don't believe they were lying when they said, we didn't find anything. I think today's Air Force, today's Pentagon probably know very little more than we do. I don't think they're the bad guys. I think it's this shadow agency. If you imagine something like a government agency that is funded outside of government, and that has strands and networks all around the world, and combine that with some sort of ancient order like the Illuminati, like powerful money and old rich families and influential people, I think that's what it is. I think there really could be people in the Pentagon tonight maybe listening to this and saying, yeah, he's right, everybody thinks we've got the bodies from Roswell under the Pentagon, and even we don't know where they are. There are examples of that where, like, President Clinton had to ask, who's hiding the UFO secrets. He was the president, and he couldn't figure out. That shows me, I think it's buried so deep, it's buried outside of government today.
So that what it sounds like you're saying is that the Air Force or the military has total plausible deniability because they're not in the loop. It's just totally outside of their. But yeah. I mean, maybe at one point in time, but not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's like with Roswell. We know that the military from the base went out to recover the wreckage, and we know that the bodies and from testimony and the wreckage was supposedly taken to Wright Field, today Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But, the military's job is to defend the country. They're limited to a degree in, preserving alien bodies in cryogenic materials or formaldehyde and having the ability to autopsy the bodies. That would be more for sort of private industry. And I think that's what happened, that at some point all this material was shipped out to these huge, very powerful private corporations, that do contract work for government agencies but actually aren't part of the government. And I think that's why, look, back in the 40s and 50s, you had a lot of military people come forward who said they saw alien bodies stored at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and things like this, in underground bunkers. We hardly ever get those stories now. And I don't think it's because the secrecy's clamped down. I think it's because it's just not at Wright-Patterson anymore. I just think it really is, probably some huge corporations' vaults where they deal with things like genetics and DNA and viruses, and they're the ones who are tasked with it because they're the experts in the fields that you would need to study alien bodies.
So what you're saying is Monsanto has the bodies.
Well,
maybe.
I wish I knew who exactly it is, but I mean, yeah, that sort of logic, I think, is the right approach. The people, if weapon systems were found on board, the Roswell wreckage, then arguably that technology would be shared with companies that are at the forefront of developing exotic weapons because they'd be the ideal people. The military uses weapons. It isn't necessarily in a position to research the whole process of developing new weapons. That's farmed out, to companies.
Yeah, like Lockheed and Thiokol and all those good boys. So there's Miriam. What about other people that have been associated with Roswell? Have there been any other strange or mysterious things that have happened to any of them?
Well, yeah, there actually is. Back in the 1990s, stories began to circulate, some from old-timers and also from people who claim to have had access to old 1940s documents. There were stories that when the Roswell event occurred, and also other crashed UFO events in New Mexico in the summer of 47, that some of the recovery teams were exposed to what we might call an alien virus. That when they stumbled on the bodies and got close to the bodies and the bodies were torn apart and organs and blood on show and whatever, that microbes, viruses had obviously got into the atmosphere. And the story is that a number of these technicians died very, very quickly, literally within hours, from sort of profuse bleeding from their ears, nose, mouth, etc., and die very quickly. It sounds almost like today something like Ebola. although certainly Ebola doesn't work that quickly. But nevertheless, that was the story. Now, because the story kind of surfaced in the mid-90s unofficially, and even the documents that refer to it, people said, well, are they the real thing? You know, they were like the so-called MJ12 documents that some people think are real and other people think aren't real. But so, in other words, the story ended up in limbo. But just a few years ago, when I was digging into not just the Roswell crash, but what else was going on in Lincoln County at the time, because I always think that's an important thing, you know, see what else is going on. I found that the FBI had declassified a file, or portions of a file, that actually runs through almost a couple of thousand pages, of which about 700 have been released. And it dealt with outbreaks of weird and exotic diseases and viruses in the United States in the 40s. And funnily enough, there was an entire outbreak of a weird plague in Lincoln County in the summer of 47 where the Roswell event occurred. And a number of people living in Lincoln County died very, very quickly, adults and children. They were all taken to a nearby medical military installation called Fort Stanton. And despite the best of the efforts of the doctors, you know, they all died. None of them survived. Now, what's interesting is that some of the wreckage that's found in Lincoln County was reportedly taken to a highly classified military base in New Mexico called the Sandia Base. Well, these files also talk about this weird plague breaking out at the Sandia Base in the same time frame. So, in other words, these official documents, which have been officially released through the Freedom of Information Act, actually add to the rumors that at these crash sites at Lincoln County and elsewhere, that there was some sort of, you know, virus on display, or, you know, it sort of got into the atmosphere in the immediate area, and people close enough to it were affected. And I think that could be one of the reasons for the secrecy. You know, it's one thing to find wreckage and dead UFOs or whatever. It's another thing to have a potentially lethal alien virus on the loose that we would have no sort of inherent immunity against, you know, because it would be extraterrestrial. There wouldn't be a precedent. So our body's immune systems would be unable to cope with it, and it may just be good luck that the crash has occurred in the desert, and you know the virus didn't survive long enough to spread outside of the local area.
Yeah, and for people that haven't been to Lincoln County, there's like 3 people that live there. No lie.
Yeah.
It's pretty. I have ex-relatives that live in Lincoln County or the next county over, and the nearest Walmart is like 30 miles away. Something like that. Isolated. It's really isolated. But
what's interesting, you know, what's interesting is I went out there in 2010. Now, back in 47, the rancher Brazel, when he collected the wreckage, the story is that he actually transferred quite a lot of the bigger pieces into an old shed on the property. That shed's actually still there. I had to wander around in it, and although it's been sort of reconcreted on the outside and it's got a new roof, it's still the same shed. So I really don't know why somebody doesn't get permission, you know, ask the present owners, you know, could we sort of, you know, just dig in the entire area, sort of 15 feet all around the, you know, the shed, and just see if anything crops up?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. You know what would be interesting is if there was access to those really old medical records, or if for some reason they kept, you know, tissue samples or blood samples. I mean, it would be really old to see if they could actually figure out what this thing was in a contemporary light.
Well, I think the thing is that they probably did. I mean, when like the Air Force, when they couldn't find any files on Roswell, one of the things they did discover, and this is why I don't think the Air Force is hiding anything, because they openly admitted that not only did they not find anything, but they also found something else, that all of the outgoing records from the Roswell base from 1945 to 1949 were gone. I mean, that's not a rumor, that's a fact. All the records from the base from that period they're just gone. And if the Air Force were responsible for hiding the truth, I don't think they would have admitted to that. But they were the ones who brought it to our attention that, hey, all the files are gone. So in other words, to get back to your point about, you know, where are the reports on, the blood work and autopsies and things like that. I'm sure they do still exist, but kind of like with all the files that vanished from 45 to 49, there's probably some huge archive, kind of like the final scenes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where all of this documentation, it could be, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages of autopsy reports and photographs of the wreckage on the Foster Ranch back in 47, old black and white pictures. The problem is not that it may exist. The problem is we just don't know where to look for it. Everybody in the official world has said, we've gone looking and we don't have it. So if that's the truth, and I actually think it is the truth, it's a real challenge to know who's hiding it when the agency itself probably doesn't even really, isn't acknowledged to exist. So how do you find it?
Well, and I wasn't talking about like any alien autopsies. I was talking about the people that died from this mysterious plague.
Oh, well, those reports are actually in the files. Yeah, they're actually being released where you've got, you've got the doctor's reports talking about, there's one like a 6-year-old boy, and he was autopsied, and he talks about how, he developed this plague very, very quickly, and they did all they could to save him, and but there were questions about the nature of the plague. And the reason why it's such an extensive and actually top secret file and it was opened was because everybody involved in the investigation, which included the FBI, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Air Force, and even the CIA, they all came to the conclusion that this outbreak wasn't like an innocent outbreak or an accidental outbreak, but it had been done deliberately. So in that sense, we actually do have a number of the files. But in saying that, as I said, the entire file is roughly 2,000 pages, and so far, I think it's like 740 pages, something like that, have been declassified so far.
What about the people that, supposedly collected the debris and put it on the ship? Those ancillary people, wouldn't they get sick also? Wouldn't you think?
Well, that's an interesting thing because reportedly, no, they didn't. And the only way you could really explain that is because the story is that it's kind of like when any aircraft explodes in the sky, different things are rained down at different points. And there are stories about the bodies supposedly coming down in like a small escape pod, like an emergency escape pod, but, they slammed into the ground and were killed anyway. So, in other words, if, you're at one particular site where the bulk of the wreckage is, and the bodies are, say, half a mile away or something like that, and you don't even know about it at that time, and the virus, actually only has a short lifespan outside of the host, then it's not impossible that unless you were really on the scene quickly, you wouldn't be affected by the bodies. It's kind of like if somebody gets chickenpox. If you're around them when they're contagious, you're going to get it. But if you're around them when they've still got all the spots but they're no longer contagious, you're not going to get it, but they still look sick. Mm-hmm. And it can be like that. The virus isn't active all the time. So it may have just been bad luck that whoever was there immediately afterwards, may have been affected. I mean, Brazil, for example, who reportedly may have seen the bodies, he wasn't affected, clearly. So in that sense, if there was a viral component to the bodies he saw, it may have just sort of dwindled away before, in the 2 days or whatever before he found them.
Do you think that is why NASA put the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts into quarantine, because of a fear of what happened in the 40s?
Well, we can never be sure that it was because of what happened in the 40s, but I mean, NASA is quite open about the fact that, when the astronauts come back, they have to go through a decontamination because of a fear of bringing something back that could contaminate the planet. I mean, that's not top secret. NASA quite openly admits that. And in the 1960s, Britain, Russia, the US, and various other countries all signed quite openly with the UN a charter that, to try and ensure that no hazardous materials were brought back. And that's why the astronauts do go through this process. But probably the most famous example of all this was a novel that was turned into a movie in the early 70s written by Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park. It's called the Andromeda strain, and it's about a US space probe that comes back to Earth and crashes out in Arizona, and it has these alien microbes attached to it that start affecting the human population, and so the battle's on to try and prevent it spreading worldwide, and just wiping every one of us out. And of course, the possibility of an alien virus doing that is very possible. For example, if we look at number of terrestrial viruses, I mean Ebola, that's lethal. Rabies, when you get rabies and if that's not treated in time, I mean, there's no turning back. You just go like you actually end up like a zombie before you're dead. People go crazy and insane and have to be restrained. And like with HIV, today people with HIV can live pretty much normal length lives, providing they've got all the cocktail of whatever drugs they need. But if they stop taking them, the disease comes back. And that's just terrestrial viruses we have problems fighting. Imagine if we got to combat something that was sort of from another world. I seriously think that if it could affect us, we really wouldn't stand a chance. It would wipe us out.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. We're gonna move. We're gonna change directions here a little bit. So I'm going to turn our attention to abductions, because some people say that abductions are 100% alien. Some say the government have a role. Are there cases where the government have had a hand in a perceived alien encounter?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are examples where people have had abduction experiences, and then after that, they've reportedly been abducted by military personnel who wanted to know what happened during the alien abduction. And these have become known as MILABs, military abductions. And again, when you read these stories, it kind of sounds like it's not the regular military doing it. It sounds almost like a paramilitary or, again, like a private corporation that's doing it, rather than, the Air Force having some quick response team. But yeah, I mean, this to me is interesting because it suggests that there are people in government who, we assume the government has all the answers. I actually don't think the government does have all the answers. They probably may not have many of the answers. Just because you've got, let's say hypothetically, there are 5 crashed UFOs stored away that have come down over the last 50 years, and we've got, say, 17 bodies. Well, all that tells you is that somebody's been skulking around in the dead of night. They've occasionally crashed, and they're clearly not from here. But it doesn't really tell you anything about what they are or what they want. Are they extraterrestrial? Are they interdimensional? Are they time travelers? Are they some ancient human race that lives under the ground, and comes out now and again? And I think these MILABs are sort of a good indication that even with abductions, the government doesn't really know what's going on. And so they take the approach that, well, if we're not able to get the answers from the aliens themselves, let's monitor and watch the abductees. And that would make a lot of sense. If people are being abducted and you want to find out about abductions, we watch the abductees. I think that's a valid area of, actually it's logical, I should say. It's not valid from the perspective of the person, but it's logical that approach would be taken. And I've investigated a lot of cases where abductees have had sort of weird hang-up phone calls, typical of the Men in Black, and mail interference. To give you a classic example, the late Dr. Carla Turner wrote a number of very good books about her UFO experiences, one being, excuse me, there's a spider on my arm, just a second. Sorry about that. There's a story about Dr. Carla Turner. She wrote a book called Into the Fringe, a very good book, and she corresponded with a fellow researcher and author, a good friend of mine, Greg Bishop, about her abduction experiences, and every piece of correspondence between Greg and Carla arrived opened, or torn open and resealed, but done so in a fashion to make it clear that both Greg and Carla knew that that they were being watched. So it was like an intimidation. And I see that time again. I've got a lot of stories like that in abduction law.
Well, I'm glad they don't do that to me. That'd be creepy.
Yeah, not that.
I'm just trying to like find anything really like, because you hear stories of people that are getting like too close to the truth in the general sense of the word, and then weird stuff happening to them. Like the fast acting cancers. You were talking about this plague, but that sounds more like it might have been associated with the explosion and not necessarily the aliens themselves.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that research is being done today into, modified viruses and things like this, and, killing someone in a fashion where it looks like they've just fallen sick very quickly and, developed cancer or whatever, and they're gone in no time at all. And, of course, when somebody does die from something like a cancer, it's extremely difficult to prove that it just wasn't bad luck, It's not, if you've got a bullet in you, it's clearly suspicious. But if you've just died from something that, you could develop, anyone could develop, then it is sort of like a plausible cover story. And you would never really know, I guess.
I know, and I'm going to say something kind of unpopular here, but what's new?
No, nothing wrong with being unpopular.
I mean, when the news came out that Philip Coppens was sick, that kind of went through my mind. Was he sick or did he have help?
Well, I mean, one of the things I always point out with people when I wrote this book or started to write it, one of the things you have to be aware of is that, as I said, most people within ufology have not died in unusual circumstances, but occasionally they have. But we also have to remember that ufologists aren't ufologists first. What they are first is regular people like all the rest of us. None of us are invincible. We're all on a time limit, even though, we all hope we're not, but we are. So, in other words, when like a UFO researcher drops dead at, say, 35, people get suspicious. But if a footballer who's 35 drops dead on the pitch, then it's seen as a big tragedy. You can find dozens of stories of footballers, just dropping down dead, or baseball players, It happens occasionally. But there is this tendency when it happens in ufology that it has to be suspicious. And so I always point out to people that while I do think I know there are a significant number of suspicious deaths in ufology. I mean, I talk about literally dozens in the book. Equally, you are going to have some UFO researchers who, because the sheer number of them, you are going to have one or two who die in car crashes in the same way that, if you've got 6,000 people at a game or something, or 50,000, one of them is probably going to get killed in the next 12 months in an accident. If you counted 50,000 people, one or two of them probably would die. So I think we need to keep that thought in mind as well, that just because somebody's a researcher and they die young, that it has to be mysterious. It would be mysterious if nobody else died at 35, but, in all walks of life, people die at 35, Okay.
It still did cross my mind, though. But
I think it should cross our minds as to which cases are legitimate murders, because for the sole reason, as I point out in the book, it's not like we're talking one or two and a few maybes. I mean, I'd probably talk about 40 in the book where I'm absolutely sure, the people were murdered or were made to vanish. And 40 is still a substantial amount, 40 or 50. It may even be more than that. So, we are dealing with a real phenomenon. We are dealing with a significant number of people. But I still feel, we need to sort of look at it from a balanced perspective and don't think that every time a UFO researcher dies, there's something suspicious. I mean, it's like when Philip Corso died, who wrote The Day After Roswell. He died the year after it came out in 97. He died in 98. People said, see, he was killed. But, I mean, he was like 86, And why kill him after the book came out? if you want him gone and you don't want him to tell his story, you get rid of him before the book's published, not after. To kill him after the book came out would be pointless and would draw more suspicion. So, I think he died of old age. J. Allen Hynek, people said, well, he died of a brain tumor. Maybe it could have been instilled in him. Well, yeah, it could, but he was pushing 77 when he died. Yeah. So you have to be balanced. You have to look at it from a balanced perspective.
So if you were to, look at those 40 plus cases that you have looked at, what would be the most suspicious to you? Well,
I would say the 1949 death of the first U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. Forrestal was a guy who, in the Second World War, he was the Secretary of the Navy. Then when, after the Second World War, the whole sort of intelligence and military infrastructure was altered, President Truman elected Forrestal as the first Secretary of Defense. Now, there are a lot of stories and whistleblowers and different people who said that when Forrestal got the job, he was briefed on the potential threats that the Russians were going to start posing in the next few years, or the Chinese, and the problems in North Korea and things like this. But the story is that he was also briefed on what was known about the UFO subject. Now, bear in mind, this was September 47 when he received the posting as Secretary of Defense. Roswell was only 2 months before, so there may not have been too much to tell him beyond that, well, somebody's flying around. It's not us. It's not the Russians. It's not the Australians or the Brits or whoever. We don't know who it is, but we're pretty sure they're not human because we've got these strange bodies and this wreckage. And the follow-on story is that Forrestal was actually shown all this, and he didn't respond well to it. It is a fact that he had a few psychological issues prior to getting the position, where he didn't react well with people. He didn't mix well with people. He kept his emotions very much bottled up. His wife was an alcoholic. They were always at each other's throats. And this had nothing to do with UFOs. This was just, their marriage. But the story is that after Forrestal was exposed to all this, and perhaps a few dark issues relating to the phenomenon, that this ingrained kind of stress and psychological issue got worse and worse. Now, regardless of whether it was caused by UFOs or not, but I think there's a very good chance part of it was, the fact is that throughout 48 and early 49, Forrestal descended into like a state of like psychosis, like a complete nervous collapse. And he was actually hospitalized at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in early 49, ostensibly for his own good. Now, other whistleblowers have said that Forrestal had concluded that because this UFO phenomenon existed and it was being held very tightly by, just a small group of men, he felt that the world should know. And the story is he was going to blow the whistle. He was going to tell the press. He was going to tell everybody. And, of course, whoever was hiding the truth, there was just no way they were going to allow that to happen. So the story is that's why they essentially had Forrestal taken into care at the military hospital, where he had no way of getting out. Now, we know from the military personnel who sat with him in the room, his guards, that he actually got much better as the months progressed, to the point where he was eating well, showering and shaving. In other words, he was looking after himself. He wasn't just sitting in the corner with his head in his hands shaking or whatever. And one of the military guys who sat with him more than any other, they actually became good friends, and Forrestal clearly was never going to go back to his job as Secretary of Defense. But he offered this military guy a job as his personal chauffeur. So, in other words, Forrestal was looking forward to his new life when he got out of hospital. And his brother kept phoning the hospital and saying, I want to take him home, I want to bring him home. He's clearly much better. And every time he would phone, another reason would come up as to why he couldn't come out. As if they were fearful of letting him out for what he might say. Now, what happened was that his brother got sick of this, and on the morning of May the 21st, 1949, Forrestal's brother phoned the hospital, and he said, whether you like it or not, I'm coming tomorrow morning, and I'm bringing him home, and you can do what you like, but I'm bringing him home. Now, if Forrestal was on the verge of revealing the truth about UFOs, and his brother phoned in the early morning of the 21st, and was going to take him home on the 22nd, if you wanted to get rid of him, you could only do that late on the night of the 21st or in the early hours of the 22nd. And funnily enough, that's actually when he died, just hours after his brother said, I'm taking him home. The official story is that he jumped to his death or hung himself and the cord broke and he fell to his death from a 16th floor window of the hospital and came crashing down on a third floor canopy that stuck out from the main part of the building. Of course, if you're going to fall 13 floors from a building, none of us are Superman. You're not going to survive that, and he didn't. Now, there were actually a lot of weird issues surrounding the alleged suicide. For example, one of the theories was that he took the cord off his dressing gown, tied it round his neck and double knotted it so it wouldn't come loose. And then he took the other end of the cord, tied it round the radiator, double knotted it so that end wouldn't come loose, and then climbed out of the window and lowered himself down the other side with a view to hanging himself. But the story is that the cord snapped and he fell to his death. But if you think about it, how long is a cord around a dressing gown? Would it be long enough to tie it round your neck and double knot it, tie the other end around a radiator and double knot it, then actually climb out of the window, then lower yourself down the other side? It's like how long, how much cord was there? So that is sort of suspicious. What's even more suspicious is that very much like Miriam Bush, we talked about earlier, before Forrestal was essentially put in the hospital for his own good, so to speak, he started telling his friends that he was fearful that something terrible was going to happen to him, that he was being watched. And we actually do know he was being watched by some weird people. For example, just before he was taken to the hospital, these three creepy characters, who actually sound not unlike the Men in Black, turned up on his doorstep, and one of them tried to sort of get into the house in an underhanded fashion, claiming to be from the post office. And this is sort of typical tactic of the Men in Black. They claim they're census takers, or they're lost, can they use a phone, that sort of thing. But there was something very wrong about this guy. He looked weird and creepy, and his clothes were strange, just like the Men in Black. And it almost seems like this was done for Forrestal's, not for his benefit, but to actually try and destabilize him by letting him know that somebody weird was watching him. And I mean, to give you an example, not long before his death, Forrestal actually spoke with a good friend of his, a man named William O. Douglas. He was actually an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And Forrestal said to Douglas, he said, Bill, something awful is about to happen to me. So in other words, he knew that something was going down. And, he knew, I think his time was kind of limited if he didn't have the ability to get the story out, which unfortunately he never did.
It makes you wonder if they were doing something, in addition to try to make him seem crazy to, justify them locking him up.
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, he was definitely, medicated up to the eyeballs at one point, and incapable really of doing too much at all. But the doctors, at least, did take good care of him. And there's no doubt that the military guys who were watching him, they weren't there in a sinister capacity. As I said, one of them actually became really good friends with Forrestal, a young guy, and, they were going to work together and said chauffeur and boss, so to speak. So in that sense, I don't think everybody, involved in his treatment was, a sinister figure. It may just have been one or two, because at the time he died, the military guy who was on duty at the time, which was another guy, not the regular one, he got called away under circumstances we're not really sure of today. And it was when Forrestal was left alone in the room that then when he came back, Forrestal was gone. He was out the window. It was almost as if somebody had taken steps to ensure that when it went down, that Forrestal would be alone. So that's kind of suspicious as well.
Well, I like your thought about the radiator thing. I mean, I'm just imagining. So now I have this thing tied around my neck, and now
Yeah,
my face is right by a radiator because the cord's not all that long.
yeah.
How would you get out? Then it has to go over the windowsill.
No, you'd kind of like strangle yourself trying to get out the window. Never
That's
mind
right.
the other
And you'd
side.
have to be a contortionist at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah. And I mean, he actually was he worked as a professional boxer at one point, but I mean, he wasn't built like Mr. Universe or something. He was just he wasn't someone with like a 60-inch waist or something like that. He was just a regular guy. So I think things like that, the timing of it, the rumours about him being watched, the strange people knocking on his front door just before he was taken into hospital. I think all of this, part of it may have been instilled to when they realised he was going over the edge. Somebody might have said, well, the best thing we can do is push him over the edge. I think that could be a possibility. Just
Well,
if we, you know.
on that note, we are going to go to break because it is that time. So I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Nick Redfern about his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. We'll be back with Nick after these words from our sponsors. Nick, new topic. I mean, kind of going on the other a topic we were touching on before, but a slightly different topic. Because you were talking about where those people got sick from kind of a plague thing. But do you know if there are any stories or reports of people being killed by the ETs themselves? I mean, the plague seems kind of, a secondary effect.
Yeah.
But
Well, there are a few stories. For example, I have a chapter in the book. Everybody's heard of cattle mutilations. Many people haven't heard of human mutilations, although it is a genuine phenomenon. It's just not, thankfully, it's not as common, at least as far as we know. Although, thousands of people do go missing every year. They never turn up again, so who knows? But, I have a chapter in the book on human mutilations where bodies of people have reportedly been found in very weird circumstances with organs removed in almost identical fashion to the cattle mutes. Probably the strangest and most disturbing story I include in the book came from a man named Leonard Stringfield. Leonard Stringfield in the Second World War was an Air Force intelligence officer, and he was still with the military in 46, and at the time he was flying in an aircraft near Iwo Jima, Japan, when he saw like a little squadron of UFOs going by. And this sort of fascinated him. When he left the military and went back to his regular life, he spent a lot of his free time investigating UFOs and then began writing books on the subject and so on. And in the late 1980s, Stringfield went public with a story that had been given to him by what he said was a high-ranking military official who he trusted implicitly and who he'd known for a number of years. And the story was that this high-ranking military guy was involved in a situation in Cambodia in 1972 at the height of the Vietnam War. And it involved like a Delta Force type team of U.S. military personnel who were sent out to the jungles of Cambodia to try and track down one particular North Vietnamese unit that was operating in the area. And they trekked their way through the jungles, etc., to the area where intelligence data suggested, they should look. They didn't find the North Vietnamese, but the story is that as they entered a clearing in the jungle, they came across this huge UFO, sort of like a globe, like a huge circular shape, but sitting on a tripod form of legs. And surrounding it were these creatures that clearly weren't human. They sort of looked like the Greys, but they were sort of 5 to 6 feet tall. They weren't sort of small 3 or 4 foot tall creatures. But they were reportedly loading dead human bodies and also dead human body parts into these huge bins. It was like a meat packing factory or something like that almost. And they were then sealing the bins and loading them on board the UFO. And the military team, for all their training, the stories, they just kind of froze for a second, as you might, just trying to take it in. And that few moments allowed the aliens to sort of back away. And there was reported like a firefight where both sides, tried to wipe the other side out. And the story is that some of the military guys were killed and injured, and vice versa as well with the aliens. And the story also was that both backed away, the military retreated into the jungle, and the aliens fled onto the craft, but not before hauling all these bins on with them. And the story further, as it was told to Stringfield, was that all the people who were involved were flown out to, not to like a military base, but to a place which was just sort of dominated by guys in suits. And they were given like hypnotic suggestions and sort of mind-altering drugs and so on to try and get them to forget the event itself, and to try and instill in the witnesses like a screen memory. So in other words, the events that really happened, they would forget about, and they would just have this vague memory of perhaps, fighting the North Vietnamese, and they just thought that their mind had blocked it out. But apparently it worked for a while, but sort of after 5-10 years, it seemed to wear off, this sort of deep hypnotic suggestion, and eventually they all came to realize what really happened. The buried memories finally came out, and that's why Stringfield's source came forward. And I think that case, perhaps more than any other, kind of typifies why there might be so much secrecy. It's one thing to say UFOs are here and aliens have crashed, and we've got bodies, etc., etc. But it's a very different thing to have to admit, people are being stolen, and we're finding evidence of limbs strewn around different places and blood and organs. I don't really know how any government would actually probably be willing to admit to that. I think they prefer just to bury it rather than even attempt to try and tell people.
Well, the blood part, it's like, okay, cattle mutilations, no blood. This one, blood, that doesn't seem right. But yeah, I could see that.
The body parts for,
I could see that being a bit discerning, because it's not like you can have a neighborhood watch per se. Unless there was some way that you could, fight these extraterrestrials in case they came into your neighborhood. But it would just seem like it would be, pretty.
Well, it's kind of like with the cattle mutilations that, there have been thousands and thousands over the years, but no one's ever been caught. And if it is extraterrestrials, then clearly they have technologies that allow them to move in, do what they do, and get away. And the military is unable to stop them. If they had stopped them, we would know, we'd have evidence. But there's so many, thousands of cases where it's almost like magic that they're able to get in and mutilate animals and remove organs and blood and everything else right under the noses of ranchers all across the United States. Never make a mistake, never ever get caught. That is the situation. It's just never ever happened. It's every time they've been successful. So we could be looking at something similar where wouldn't even matter if you got neighborhood watch or the military, that they're clearly unable to stop the cattle mutes. So logically, why should it be any different for the human mutes too?
That's a little discerning. And then it makes you think of the people that are abducted. Are we talking about the same group that's doing the abduction? Are they also doing this work as well? Or is it a different group? Because the MO is completely different.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's a tendency often for people to think the UFO phenomenon is one thing and, the greys are it, so to speak. But I think that there's clearly enough reports on record to suggest that there's not just one phenomenon. We hear about the greys, we hear about the so-called space brothers, the Nordics, we hear about the reptilians, we hear about creatures that kind of look like the greys but are bigger. Then they're like the insectoids, like the praying mantis types. And I always kind of find it funny a little bit when people say, the aliens are good or the aliens are bad. There's no creature really on the planet that is good or bad. It's like a shark. A shark will eat you in the sea, but a shark protects its babies. You know, so the shark's not evil. It's just we perceive it as evil because we potentially are its food. You know, most of us don't go around committing murder purely and simply because we know we shouldn't. But there's always somebody whose brain is just not wired right, you know, and they become serial killers or mass murderers. So, but we're all capable of doing that. You know, like troops on the battlefield, they have to do terrible things sometimes to survive and prevent, you know, their country, whichever country, being overthrown. And you may have to do things that you wish you didn't have to do, even though they're the enemy, you know. So I think it's probably the same with the UFO phenomenon. It's not as simplistic as it's good or bad. There are competing factions and different things going on that we perceive as bad because it impacts us in a negative way. But from their perspective, it may be no different from us. You know, we don't, you know, so we don't hate cattle or pigs, but we eat them. But we don't eat them because we hate them. You know, we eat them because we're meat eaters. And I think that could be the same. You know, if the aliens do something terrible to us, we assume they're bad. It may not, you know, they may not even have a single thought about us. We're just a commodity, possibly. Not the enemy, you know, just literally a commodity.
Has this phenomena occurred frequently, or is this kind of an oddity, even in comparison to cattle mutilation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have cattle mutilation reports going back decades. There's thousands of them, you know, all across the media. I know somewhere in the region of about 30 or 40 rumours of human mutilations, kind of like the Stringfield story and other ones. And interestingly enough, the FBI has declassified its file on cattle mutilation. It's a really interesting file. It goes back to the 70s. You can find it at the FBI's website called The Vault. There's a section of The Vault called Unexplained Phenomena, and the cattle mute file is in that section. You can download it as a PDF. I mean, it's filled with stuff about strange pods and tripod marks found at landing sites where cattle mutilations also occurred, and where you had elevated radiation readings. And this is all in the official files. It's not like a whitewash. It's like a really mind-blowing file on real cattle mutilations. And within the file, there is actually a reference to where the director of the FBI received a memo where one of the FBI field officers had heard rumours that the cattle mutes were forerunners for human mutilations, and that's actually all spelled out in the file. So we do know that as far back as the mid-70s, people in government were getting antsy about these rumours of human mutes. Now, certainly we don't have enough physical evidence of, you know, people being mutilated every year, but what we do have, which is a fact, is that, you know, literally thousands and thousands of people go missing every year and are never seen again. Now, some of them obviously start new lives, you know, run away with someone and change their names or whatever. Others may be living, you know, in the wild. Others might be, you know, just hiding out for whatever reason. But I think that doesn't rule out the possibility that some of these people may be, you know, really gone, so to speak.
They need to just wear little things that say "eat more chicken" or something. I don't know. I mean that's just kind of weird and creepy, and makes me go, I'm not going in the dark woods alone. Ever.
Well, you know, I mean, the way I look at it is that you know, even if you investigate UFOs or you run around the woods looking for Bigfoot, the chance of you becoming dinner for ETs is probably pretty small, you know. But,
yeah, I guess that would be right up there with having a sighting, which, as you and I know, it's just like, yeah, right, that's going to happen today. You know, so one of the things that you talk about is the government having instructions on how to eliminate somebody. Is that true? I mean, talk about that a little bit, because I was just like, really?
Yeah, this is sort of pretty incredible. This is a CIA document that surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. What it actually deals with is the CIA's the file. It's like a huge file. and it deals with the CIA's interest in when Guatemala in Central America was under going through a very fraught situation in the 1950s, and the CIA was concerned and worried as to which faction of government or the military or whoever, the rebels, is going to come to power, and how might that impact on the US. So there was this huge CIA project, looking at what was going down in Guatemala. Now, a number of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, the CIA finally declassified most of its files on the Guatemala situation. And buried within this collection was a document about 25, 30 pages titled A Study of Assassination. And it was an official CIA document, and again, which is officially surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. And it's basically like a handbook, or like a booklet, I should say, for CIA agents, telling them the best way to kill people and make it look like an accident or a suicide. Now, interestingly enough, the one scenario that was said to work best of all was to throw someone out of a high window, like 10, 12 stories up, which, interestingly enough, is exactly what happened to James Forrestal. It even talks in there about, if you throw the person off a bridge, that might not work as well, because if there's water below, it might actually cushion the fall and they might survive. So always try and throw them out of a window where there's concrete below. And, this is an official document. And, it outlines the ways in which if the person who commits the murder isn't able to escape from the scene, they should pretend that they actually stumbled upon the person and act as like the shocked witness, who found the body. So it's really bleak and cold-hearted, oh, this is the best way to kill someone, throw them out a window, don't throw them off a bridge, they might survive.
So it's kind of like you watch these I like crime dramas on TV, and the police show up on the scene and there's somebody trying to do life, saving measures, but it turns out to be the killer. And so they probably had advice like that.
Oh, yeah, that's what it says. It said, if you're unable to get out of the area quick enough, act as like the shocked first responder, that kind of thing. And so a lot of thought had gone into it, and it's an amazing document to see that somebody went to the trouble of. But I guess that's war. That's espionage. When you're fighting for your freedoms, things have to be done sometimes in the name of survival.
So in that document, what was the weirdest or most interesting, intriguing, I guess what jumped out at you as far as their methods of bumping people off were?
Well, I mean, a lot of them, in fairness, were sort of what you would call down to it, like pushing somebody off a bridge, into water or off a building, making a suicide, like with a gun. A murder, killing someone with a gun, but make it look like a self-inflicted wound. There was nothing that was really sort of definitively weird. It was just more along the lines of, just making sure that sort of every aspect is covered when you're, when you're going to do this. So it wasn't so much. It wasn't like some of these stories you hear about when they had these plans to give Fidel Castro exploding cigars, to kill him. That was one of the plans. But, this file isn't like this. This is more sort of down to earth of sort of regular agents getting in and just getting the job done, so to speak.
Okay. I wonder how long it'll be before that, is all over the internet. Or is it already all over the internet?
Oh, yeah, the document was declassified about 6 years ago, and you can find it online at a number of websites and download it and read it, and it's interesting. A lot of thought's gone into it. I said it's like 30 pages altogether.
We need that kind of help and motivation.
Sort of lethal drugs and poisons and how they could be, covertly, inserted like a food supply, that kind of thing, or a drink.
Like we need that kind of information. We're already bad enough. Well, I think it's interesting. They complain about the crime rate, and then they put shows like Forensic Files on TV, and they show you, all the things you shouldn't do, like don't leave your DNA, and all this stuff. Anyway,
Well, of
so
course, back then, I mean, that wouldn't have applied in Forrestal's time.
mhm.
Finding people's DNA, there was just no way to do it back then. That fingerprints could be taken, but you're not going to find back in '49. You're not going to find somebody's DNA on a knife because there was no way to extract the DNA. The technology didn't exist back then.
But they could do blood typing, which I think they did at that point.
They could take fingerprints, to see what was on a blade or whatever. But it's like when, for example, they actually find DNA evidence today. The person cuts themselves or that kind of thing. That was impossible 60 years ago. It just didn't exist.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of shift gears here again. So there are people like Stephen Greer and his followers that try to communicate with ETs telepathically. Mm-hmm. Do you know if this method of contact has been tried by anybody else? And if so, what were their results?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people have tried it over the years, and I actually think it works. I think there's a certain aspect of the UFO phenomenon, the intelligence behind the phenomenon, where they actually interact with us on a very sort of personal, one-to-one basis. It's not. That's why I think we've never had the sort of typical thing of, the landing on the White House lawn that everybody talks about. That's never happened, and it may never will happen. But what has happened, people who've had sort of profound UFO experiences feel sometimes that there's still like a psychic connection with the entities themselves, where they could go to bed at night and meditate and ask for something or a sign or something like this, and then suddenly the next day the phone rings and it's a researcher who's been trying to track them down who can help them or something, or they're put in touch with another person in their life. You get that a lot, where, for example, two people who've had UFO experiences, it's like they're almost brought together under very odd and synchronistic circumstances, if somebody's trying to guide them together. There are a lot of stories like that. Where people actually sort of got married or become like boyfriend and girlfriend, not realizing that they both had very similar UFO experiences. And so I think that there is this sort of very deep psychic connection where you can actually put the thought out, and something will pick it up, and you'll get the message that you're looking for, or at least part of it.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people that
nuts and bolts. I think there is like a major psychic component to the whole UFO issue.
But in the community, I mean, I've heard of a number of people that talk to Zeta Reticulans and the Galactic Command. From your research and your work, either through like government channels, do you think anyone takes that material seriously?
Well, yeah, I do.
Okay.
I don't say it's necessarily we're in touch with something that is literally called like the Galactic Command. That kind of sounds sci-fi like. But I do believe that people who have had abduction experiences, sometimes they feel compelled to go out to certain locations. And this also relates to the contactee movement, where contactees felt compelled to go out to desert locations, not knowing why, as if something had been instilled in their mind to tell them to do it. And they go out, and then sure enough, half an hour later, they see a light in the sky, and it gets closer and closer, and it lands. And then before you know it, they're on board a UFO. If you read, for example, Whitley Strieber's early books like Transformation and Communion, I mean, it's clear that he was talking about entities that were acted in a far more personal fashion than they did in like a detached fashion. He had experiences where they would sort of speak to him in his mind and, appear before him and anticipate thoughts and answer questions. I think there really is something to the idea that if you want to put the thought out and try and contact these entities and you've got a deep interest in the subject, it's like they know when you're looking for them, and sometimes they answer back.
Interesting. And people that have had experiences, I mean, I could understand where there would be a connection, whether they had some kind of an implant installed, which would make sense to me, or if there was some kind of, energetic, telepathic tie that was made to them to kind of get them to do exactly what you were talking about, go out to a field so that the ship could show up 20 minutes later.
Yeah, I think, the whole telepathic issue is a valid one. I mean, this really isn't much different when, the government itself got involved in the whole remote viewing program, psychically using the mind to sort of spy on the Russians or the Chinese. This is sort of sending a thought out, or your soul or your essence or whatever, and try and see what's going on in the Kremlin. So, in other words, if you can put your soul out there or your mind or a thought, then I don't see it's much different to like a radio, or a receiver picking up a transmission. I think that it is kind of something along those lines, and I think that's why you do seem to have these situations where people sometimes are thrown together for a reason, that it's just not accidental in the UFO subject, and maybe there's like a long-term goal for them that they're not seeing at that point, but that becomes clearer as time goes on. We got abducted.
Me too, but I didn't see you there.
We didn't have much time, though.
Okay, so I don't know where we were, so I'll just keep moving along. So if you were to guess about how many people associated with UFOs have mysteriously died or disappeared or had some other weird thing happen to them, what kind of number would you put with that?
Well, I mean, the ones I've uncovered, I would say somewhere between sort of 40 and 60, which over 60 years is quite a lot, We're talking one a year maybe on average, which might not sound a lot to some people, but, when you're dealing with subjects like this, to wipe out a UFO researcher just for looking into stories of UFOs and flying saucers is a pretty extreme thing to do. But as I said earlier, that clearly most people in ufology don't die under unusual circumstances, and I think the ones who do, what I found the trend seems to be, it's when they've either uncovered something that could possibly blow the whole thing wide open, like Forrestal, or somebody was fearful that somebody had got something. They may not have got it, but there was a fear that they did, and so people were like, well, let's just not take the chance, let's get rid of them. So I think that's what it all really comes down to, is it's not, if everybody in ufology was dying under weird circumstances, everybody would know because it would be so obvious. The average person in ufology, like me, who writes a book about a subject, or somebody who does a radio show, somebody writes an article, you're not a threat, because unfortunately for all the stuff we do and the investigations we do, we don't have that card, if you like, that ace card that could bring everything down. That's why people like, Edward Snowden are so different from somebody in another agency who might, reveal how some politician, overspent on his expenses when he was out of town. Because the thing with Snowden was the story that he told and the material that he took with him demonstrated, the extent to which the U.S. population was being watched. So that's why, there was such an effort to get him. But most people, like in ufology, there isn't really an Edward Snowden equivalent in ufology. No one's ever come forward, with whistleblowing documents of that type. And that's why I think the UFO scene has never really been touched to a significant degree, because whoever's keeping the secret, they know, unfortunately, and it's true, unfortunately, we don't have access to classified alien autopsy reports. We don't have access to the bodies or the wreckage. So I think from that perspective, whoever's hiding the truth, they may be a bit kind of pissed off with us and don't like us because they view us as meddling. But they also know that at the end of the day, all we have is words on paper. You know, we don't have anything that can really prove it. But when there's a fear somebody might have something, or the person is someone who really can change the world, like Forrestal, you know, the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Imagine if he called a press conference, today's U.S. Secretary of Defense, and said, "I've just seen the Roswell bodies." The whole house of cards would collapse. So that's when I think people are taken out, you know, when there really is a chance that they could change everything.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder if, you know, a UFO crashed, you know, in the middle of Texas and, you know, in Arlington, right by your house. If people at this time would run and communicate to the government, or if there's enough people that are awake that would go in there with their cameras, with their whatever, to get documentation before it was hauled away.
I actually think in today's world that is what would happen. People would be pulling out their cell phones and, you know, whatever device you've got on you at the time and uploading it to YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else. And I think it would be very difficult to stop it coming out today. But again, the problem is we're dealing with a phenomenon that, like the official angle, it sort of exists in stealth. It hides itself from us. You know, that's the issue we have. It's not just trying to find out who in the official world is hiding the truth, but there's also the fact that the phenomenon is hardly doing anything to be open with us. You know, I don't mean that from a negative perspective, that it's hostile, but it seems to want to prefer to go direct to the people, but in a very strange fashion, like telepathically, rather than, you know, landing on a massive scale. And so, for that reason, I think, you know, when you're looking at the whole complete story, what we're seeing is a picture where the government knows something, they know we know something, but they also know we don't know enough to be a major threat. And they also know that the phenomenon's not giving us enough to blow the whistle as well. So, again, for the most part, we're probably perceived as being tiresome meddlers. But that's all we are, you know, apart from the few who every year get a little bit too close, and then somebody's like, okay, that one's got to go, you know.
Or they put a spin on them and make them sound crazy, that, you know, what they're saying is just so absurd, and that they have this history of mental illness, and so that anything they say isn't taken seriously. Yeah,
I mean, that's an important point to stress. I think the murders are always the absolute last resort. You know, I don't think it's just like, oh yeah, wipe them out, you know. I think if you really can make somebody look stupid or psychotic or fantasy prone, you know, people are just going to walk away. If somebody is found dead under mysterious circumstances, even the mainstream media would probably look into that. So even if they didn't find anything, they probably would probe it. And I think whoever's doing this, that's the last thing they want. So, yeah, I think it really is sort of the ultimate option available, you know, and the last option.
And so it doesn't make you nervous digging into all of these documents and reporting it, where it seems like the government would just as soon it be forgotten?
Not really, because most of the stuff that I do is through the Freedom of Information Act. It's like, you know, go back to Edward Snowden. You know, Edward Snowden left the NSA, took all these documents with them, and handed them over to newspapers like The Guardian, etc. And, you know, the story was published. Well, those journalists themselves, you know, could get into major problems. You know, I've never, despite what some people think, and I know they think this because I've said it, you know, I've never had somebody say to me, you know, like a phone call comes through at midnight and says, you know, meet me on the bottom floor of the nearest parking lot, and, you know, I'll be in a black suit and I'm going to hand over a thick manila envelope full of documents. Yeah, that never happened to me. It never happens.
It
You know,
hasn't? Oh,
no,
man, Nick.
no.
That's
I
where I
mean, what
thought
I
you got
do,
everything.
no. The documents I have are the only documents I have in my possession are documents that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act that the government's letting us see. Now, yes, I've interviewed a lot of old timers, but I'm not, some sort of fox molder running around getting shot at in the street, in the streets or whatever, or having. I look out the window at the midnight and there's some man in black stood under the street lamp. No, nothing like that ever happens, and that's why people like Snowden do get in trouble, because they had the goods, and that's why the journalists were potentially in big trouble, because they accepted the material and published it. And that's the difference with me. I don't have people coming to me like Snowden. I don't have people leaking documents. I just go to government archives and see what's available legally, not illegally, legally, and what's been declassified legally that we can see. And on top of that, as I said, I do interview old timers, and some of them, do reveal. I saw alien bodies back in 1955, and even if that's true, the problem is they haven't got anything to prove it. So again, that's why you're not necessarily a direct threat, because we cannot prove it, even though it's all probably real. I mean, it's going on. We don't have the evidence. That's why the whole Snowden thing caused such a furor, because he did have the material and he took it out with him. That's why, the whole thing came down on him.
So what happened to the material he had?
What's that?
What happened to the material he did have?
Well, I mean, there's stories that there's some of it still to come out, and we don't sort of really know the full story of what happened to it. But the point is, why ufology hasn't been targeted to a massive degree like Snowden is because there never has been within ufology an Edward Snowden. There's never been a man or a woman from an official agency who, works on the Roswell project, if you like, and who has left that project with like 25,000 pages of autopsy reports, kind of like the equivalent to what Snowden did. That's never happened. And that's why, again, we're not a direct threat until or unless that actually does happen. If, say, hypothetically, this shadow group, somebody on the inside said, I don't think, or thought to themselves, I don't think it's right that this secret's kept, and they literally managed to get the original Roswell files out, and they handed them over to, a UFO researcher, hypothetically John Smith of Arkansas or whatever. John Smith then could be in major trouble, as would the person who released the files, in a situation that would identically parallel what happened with Snowden. But as I said, that hasn't happened. And so until it does, we're not the the direct threat that many people in ufology assume we are. Everybody thinks, oh, you're being watched all the time, you're going to be threatened and arrested. Well, no, because that draws more attention to it. And if you've got nothing to prove your case, that's why most people are left alone.
So it kind of makes me think of like Bob Lazar, who, said that he saw all of this stuff at Area 51 and came forward, and then all of a sudden he disappeared from their records, and, whatever the truth is about that, no one will really ever know.
No, but the important thing about Lazar is that nobody tried to arrest him for what he said. Now, the reason I think why he wasn't arrested, Snowden, the story Snowden told was done through documents, and everybody and his brother in U.S. intelligence has been after him ever since, the most wanted man in the United States, or what most wanted American, probably. But he took documents with him. Now, Lazar blew the whistle, allegedly, on everything to do with alien that was going on at Area 51, but absolutely nothing happened to him. And I think the reason absolutely nothing happened to him was because he didn't do what Snowden did. He didn't take anything with him. Had he taken a bunch of stuff, he would have been in major problems. But he took nothing at all. All he took was his testimony and his memories. Now, what happened was that even within ufology, some people said, well, he's telling the truth. Others said, no, he's not. He's a fantasist or whatever. And the problem is, because he had nothing to back the story up other than his own words, that's why I think nothing happened to him. He didn't have the goods, so to speak. So he was left alone. I'm sure perhaps people in Area 51 were seething about everything he revealed. But in the cold light of day, when they had probably behind-the-scenes meetings about Lazar and what to do about him, I'm sure they probably said to themselves, well, for everything he said, most people won't believe it. And even the people who do believe it, it's just the UFO people. And even if what he says is true, he can't prove it because all the documents were locked away. He didn't take anything with him. So in that sense, for everything he revealed, he wasn't even a threat, because he couldn't prove any of it.
Amazing. Where are we? So we have probably about 10 more minutes. One of the things that I find interesting, we hear stories about, these shadow governments and about UFO contact. And, the list goes on and on and on. And I just find it so, it makes your mind think. It makes my mind think about if these different stories that we hear about, if these shadow governments exist, if UFOs exist, if, it was a government conspiracy to kill JFK, all of these, I'm going to say conspiracy theories, but I feel like it's even a bigger picture, are actually true, then the world that we live in is a much different world than we're led to believe. It's almost like we are living in the Matrix.
Yeah. Well, I would actually agree with you on that. So much of history does become distorted to where we're not really sure, what the truth of anything is really, and particularly in today's world. And unfortunately, that's how things are. That's also how secrets are kept. A counter story is put out, and then another story is put out. It's like with Roswell. There are whistleblowers and people who've come forward to talk about Roswell. There's somewhere in the region of like 12 different theories have been presented to the UFO research community. And I think this is clearly being done on purpose. Within all those 12 or 13 different theories, it was a UFO, it was time travelers, it was a mogul balloon, it was a weather balloon, it was a secret German device brought over to New Mexico at the end of the Second World War, it was a Japanese craft, it was a Russian spy plane. You got all these different people from the military and the intelligence world and people just with shadowy backgrounds have come forward and offered all these different scenarios. One of them is probably the correct one, but the way you bury the truth, if you can't stop people investigating Roswell, which, it's impossible to do, then what do you do instead? Well, you swamp the research field with a bunch of fake stories with different scenarios, and nobody knows what the truth is then. In other words, the real story gets buried amongst the lies. And I think that probably applies to things when you mentioned the Kennedy assassination. People said, is it the Russians? Is it the Cubans? Is it the mafia? Is it the Mexicans? Who did it? Nobody knows. And I think probably some of those stories were created to make it so difficult for people to get to the heart of it. And I think that's why, as you said, that the world as we know it isn't as it actually is, because we have been sort of saturated with cover stories. And when it gets like the cover story so old and people who created the cover stories die off, then you're in a position where it's possible that, that the cover stories created for Roswell years and decades ago, today, maybe nobody left who created those stories. And so even the governments, even major parts of the government may actually not know which Roswell story is the true one, as weird as that sounds. Other than the very small elite of a few hundred who hide in it, the rest of them may actually be like the rest of us wondering, well, was it a weather balloon after all? Or was it a Soviet spy plane? Or was it a Russian, Chinese thing, or Japanese, or German? Secrets sometimes don't just get hidden, they get lost. They get buried, and then the people involved in the program die off, and nobody realizes it was actually a fabricated story when it comes out. You know, they think it's a real thing because it's working so well, and nobody's left to tell the truth about it.
It just makes you wonder how far back that goes. You know, is
Oh,
this
well, I'm
just like
sure.
a recent thing, or
No, I'm sure
has
you
there
can
always
find.
been this like giant spin on everything and secrets
Oh, yeah.
going
I
back
mean,
for millennia?
yeah. I mean, you look at, for example, the Romans. You know, they were always killing each other, like Julius Caesar, plotting to get rid of whoever was Caesar at that particular time, replace it with somebody else. You know, and the different factions warring against each other, and I mean, that's ancient Rome. You know, that's how it was in ancient Greece, and the Egyptians. You know, feeding the pharaoh's poison to try and get another pharaoh in power, and you know, this is less to do with UFOs or Roswell or the Kennedy assassination. It's just down to human nature, you know. That's what it comes down to. You know, wars, battles, power struggles. It's all part of the same thing, really.
Well, it's sad. So, in the couple of minutes that we have left, and I don't know if it was released yet, but your zombie book that you're writing with Brad Steiger, has that been released yet?
Yeah, it was published. It came out about 3 weeks ago, and it's like an A to Z book of everything to do with zombies. It's quite a big book. It's like 400 pages, and it deals with zombies in TV, movies, novels, folklore, history, popular culture, and also the real world. You know, there are sections on certain viruses that mimic aspects of the zombie virus, like rabies, you know, which actually does turn a person psychotic. You know, as I said earlier, in the final stages, you know, they have to be restrained. They literally are almost like something out of 28 Days Later. So, as I said, it's like an A to Z book. So you've got entries like V for virus, you know, which describes what a virus actually is, or A for apocalypse, or C for the Centers for Disease Control, which would actually be at the forefront of a real zombie outbreak. And interestingly enough, there's several sections in the book on the CDC, because the Center for Disease Control, they actually have an entire page at their website about how to combat a zombie outbreak, and it's actually written in a serious perspective by a high-ranking military officer who talks about how the infected would be rounded up, and attempts would be made to, you know, to try and uninfect them, and if not, you know, they'd have to be locked away for everybody's good. And you know, when you realise he's actually the CDC website, you know, you have to wonder, wow, do they know something we don't?
Yeah, that makes me definitely wonder, do they know something?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that, you know, this whole infection idea, concept of zombies, I mean, maybe not like what you see on TV,
No.
is something that's possible?
Well, I often get, particularly since people knew I was writing the book, and a lot since the book's come out, people have asked me, you know, do I think a real zombie virus could be created? My answer is no. Well, it depends how you define a zombie. For example, I don't believe anybody will ever create a virus to literally bring the dead back to life and turn them into flesh-eating monsters like The Walking. You know, The Walking Dead's a great show, but that's not going to happen. Now, what could happen is something like in 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later, for people who've seen those, where the zombies, they actually aren't dead. They're infected by something called the rage virus, which changes the mind to where they become homicidal killers, which is actually not that different to rabies. And so research has actually been done to try and determine if the rabies virus could be modified and synthesized, and possibly even combined with something like the flu virus, where you would then have a worse scenario of an airborne, you know, flu travels through an airborne, you know, through breathing it, and, you know, contamination that way. If you imagine rabies, which is, you know, essentially caused by bites and saliva, if that could become airborne by combining it with the flu virus, and research has actually been done on that, then we could be in for major problems. So I could see something like the development of something like the rage virus, but not something that's going to reanimate the dead. No, that's I don't think that there's a chance in hell, no pun intended, of that actually happening.
Well, that's pretty cool. And then one last thing, the music's going to come up here in 1 minute. You also did a thing for New Page book, and I didn't write down the title of that book. Has that one come out? The compilation book from New Page?
Oh, yes, the Ancient Mysteries book. Yeah, that one's just come out. I've done a chapter in there about sightings of strange creatures in the vicinity of stone circles. Reports of like werewolf-type creatures and big cats and Bigfoot-type entities, all in the vicinity of ancient stone circles and Native American burial mounds and things like this. And there's sort of an intriguing theory in there as to why that might actually be taking place, why people are seeing strange creatures around sacred sites.
Cool. See, I guess you have been busy.
Oh, well, I always like to stay busy. And, I like to do a lot of little projects as well as writing the books because, I just like to do that. I kind of, do this one day and this another, but then the long-term projects are the books. But some magazine says, can you do a 2,000-word article on this, or somebody else wants me to do something on that, and I kind of thrive on that sort of stuff,
Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm looking at the clock, which means our time is up. Nick, always a pleasure having you on the show. And everyone is saying great show tonight in the chat room. And I'm sure I will see you up close and personal sometime soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll cross paths at another conference in the near future. So.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. You have a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you soon.
You too, Rita. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye. That's Nick Redfern. His book is Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. His website is nickredfern.com.
Crash, asking if he got any caskets or coffins that were suitable for children or child size, and could they be hermetically sealed. And he realized that there was something weird going on, so he traveled out to the base, and because everybody knew him, they assumed he'd been called to the base to deal with the crash, not realizing he'd just gone of his own accord. And he ran into a nurse friend of his, or he said was a nurse, and she told him to get the hell out of here, otherwise, you're going to end up dead in the desert or whatever. But she basically told him the snippets of this story, how these weird little, sort of hideous little goblin-type bodies had been brought in, and she'd seen them, and just told him to leave. Now, Dennis didn't say anything about this, Glenn Dennis, for years. It was 1989 when he went public, and he wanted to protect the woman, and he said she was a nurse at the hospital, and he gave her the name of Naomi Self, which actually wasn't a real name. And it turns out she wasn't a nurse, but she was actually this woman named Miriam Bush, almost certainly, who was an executive secretary, as I said, at the hospital. Now, her family have since come forward to say that when she was like 25 when the crash happened, she told her mom and dad what she'd seen, and they begged them, not to say anything ever. And so that is what happened, that, she stayed quiet. But she descended into like a state of post-traumatic stress, not unlike Vern Brazel. She became a full-blown alcoholic, and, she saw like men in black on every street corner and was paranoid she was being watched. And with hindsight, she probably had a lot of justification. Well, not long after Glenn Dennis went public with his story about the nurse and what she knew, Miriam Bush got even more paranoid. She started telling the family that people were definitely watching her and following her. And she, on one occasion, towards the very end of 1989, she booked into a hotel room, actually under her sister's name, using her sister's ID and address. And she was found dead in the room the next morning with a plastic bag on her head and bruises on her arms. So it didn't really sound like suicide. And the theory is that Miriam Bush was probably one of the last people who was highly credible and who people would have listened to had she blown the whistle and gone public. And I think what happened was that Glenn Dennis told his story, and that freaked out whoever realised that Miriam Bush was still alive and she had the ability to talk, but somebody got to her first, and that never happened. And I think that actually could well be a case of murder associated with the crash.
The bruises on her arms, do you know if they were inflicted, far prior to her dying, or do they think that they happened just prior to her committing suicide?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, the case is open, but the family have gone on record as stating that they felt the death was suspicious. There's actually, you can find footage online of the family being interviewed. It's not hearsay. It was a real death. It was investigated by the local police and the coroner, and they came to the conclusion it was suicide. But the family, partly because of the bruises and the odd way of killing yourself with a plastic bag on your head, but also because
of a situation that they were exposed to.
Well, I think what this demonstrates is the way in which, for example, you have people who are exposed to traumatic events, and regardless of if they're murdered at a later point, it demonstrates possibly one of the reasons why there is UFO secrecy, because when you're sort of really exposed to the phenomenon at a close range, like bodies and so on, it may actually put someone into a complete state of shock. And, if that happened on a worldwide stage, I think that could be one of the factors that's been kind of, discussed and theorized as to why, we haven't been told the truth. Imagine 5 billion Miriam Bushes, all reacting in the same fashion, so to speak.
But I think today, in the 40s, there was only UFOs in the movies. There weren't any real ones. That was just your imagination. And to say to somebody, even today, people that are experiencers are challenged, that what their experience has been are fake or made up, or they're hallucinating or whatever. But I think if someone said that, if we all were exposed to UFOs, if they landed on the White House lawn, or, like they say, I don't know that we would be that scared anymore, because there's been so much knowledge and exposure.
I'm in kind of two minds, because the way we would respond or wouldn't respond, all we have right now is sort of theoretical ideas on how we would respond. People say, oh, well, the public wouldn't panic because everybody's watched the X-Files and Independence Day, and most people think this is all going on. And that's true. And I think, people may well not panic. But if tomorrow morning, we woke up and there were UFOs everywhere in the sky, and we're dealing with creatures that are so weirdly different to us, it's not just like saying, hey, take me to your leader, that they're just so beyond us. And you just see, thousands of ships hanging in the sky, then people might actually panic.
Well, yeah, that would be kind of threatening. I mean, even if we saw Russian ships hanging out in the sky, I think we'd all panic. And we know them.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, there is still grounds for a scenario in which sort of panic does break out. The problem is, we look at it today, and it's often dumbed down to this simplistic thing. Well, everybody's exposed to the UFO phenomenon, and so if it really happened, no one would be scared. That's kind of like saying everybody knows what a shark is, and you're not frightened of it until you get in the water, Then you are in big trouble and you are frightened. And I think it could be the same thing. Everybody knows what aliens supposedly look like, but that's very different to have one stood 4 feet in front of you coming towards you. and you have nowhere to go. You know.
Well, but even in that situation, you can't tell anybody. And if you told people, nobody would believe you anyway. So that just adds to the whole,
Well,
isolation part of it.
Well, I think the other problem is, the phenomenon itself isn't actually helping the situation.
Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed. Today, we're going to have an excellent episode because we're going to have our good friend Nick Redfern back on the show talking about his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. Let me tell you a little bit about Nick. Originally from England, Nick Redfern is the author of many books on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, werewolves, the Loch Ness Monster, paranormal phenomena, conspiracy theories, psychic powers, and Hollywood scandals. Nick writes regularly for the newsstand publications and has appeared on countless television shows. Today we're going to be talking about his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, and his webpage is nickredfern.com. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, my good friend, Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick, how are you?
Hey, Rita. I'm doing good, thanks.
Well, nice having you on the show. I was just looking online for the last time that you were on, and I'm thinking, oh, my God, it's been an entire year. I don't know how that happened. Anyway. But it's all good. So this book is about close encounters of the fatal kind. And the subtitle is Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. Are you trying to say that there's been foul play when you dig into the UFO phenomena?
Well, yes, in simple terms. It's one of these situations where clearly, most people in ufology, there's been thousands and thousands since 47, and nothing's happened to them. So in other words, it's not like UFO researchers, investigators, witnesses are dropping like flies. But there are a number of suspicious cases. There's no doubt about that amongst, the regular deaths of just from old age for most researchers. But when somebody has got a little bit too close to the truth, there are a number of suspicious cases like that. And so that's what the book is a study of. People who got a little bit too close to the truth, may have been murdered, made to look like suicide or an accident. Other cases that seem to be more connected with the UFO phenomenon itself, where we've had missing pilots and aircraft pursuing UFOs and then to suddenly plummet into the ground. So it's sort of a combination of the two, really.
Cool. Well, we're going to be digging into this as we keep going forward. So let's start our exploration with probably the most well-known UFO event, Roswell. And I know that many of the witnesses to the event and its aftermath were threatened, but did any of these threats ever play out?
Well, we're not entirely sure if any of the threats played out, but certainly, and not at the, if you're going to kill yourself, why book into a hotel room under somebody else's name? What difference is it going to make if you're going to end up dead? And the fact that, in the lead up to it, she got even more paranoid that people were watching her and following her. And this directly followed on from when Glenn Dennis actually pretty much outed her.
So do you think the Men in Black were following her? I mean, let me ask the question first. I mean, this was, you said the 80s, correct?
It's a what, sorry?
She passed away in the 80s?
Hello?
Hello?
You broke up there. Hello?
You said that she passed away in the 1980s?
Well, what happened was Glenn Dennis went public with his story in September '89 about the nurse, who almost certainly was Miriam Bush, because her family said that she told what had happened, and and then she died like in December '89. So she died like 2 months or so, or was killed 2 months after Glenn Dennis told the story of the nurse, and then rumours started to surface. Well, she's actually still alive. Now, if whoever was hiding the truth of Roswell, didn't realise she was still alive, they may have come looking for her and started a hunt for her, after 40 years. And I think it's possible that she got hints that somebody was looking for her or had found her, and maybe they were following her, trying to intimidate her into silence. And but then when Glenn Dennis actually told the whole thing, then that may have been perceived as, well, if the press get to her first, this is a woman of major significance, the executive secretary at the base hospital. She's not like some Mr. X talking off the record. People would have listened to her, and that could well have been, she could have well have been one of the last few people who was on site, if you like, to see the bodies who, hadn't passed away from old age in '89.
And this might sound like a silly question, because you mentioned the Men in Black a couple of times. Were there reports, or have there been reports of Men in Black going back to the late '80s? Or is that a more new phenomena?
No, the Men in Black stories go back to the '40s. I'm not aware of anything to do with Miriam Bush where she said anything like she was being watched by, creepy Men in Black with fedoras and black suits. Nothing like that. It was just she was paranoid and suspicious that someone was watching her or looking for her. And, that's actually kind of quite plausible. If you think sort of 50 years ago an event happens and you don't realize somebody is still around to talk about it. Back in the 80s, before the internet and things like that, even for the government, it might have been, or whoever was involved, it may have been a challenge to try and find her. She using different names and traveling around and, living alone in this sort of little apartment and so forth. And so, she may have had justification, but there's nothing to sort of definitely, or anything at all to say that, she got visits from literal Men in Black. So.
Okay. It just is sad to hear a story like that of somebody that basically tries to live in obscurity.
Yeah.
Because
time at least, but certainly there have been some unusual deaths associated with the Roswell crash. Now, for people who aren't aware, the crash itself occurred on a large ranch called the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, in July '47. Lincoln County is actually today. It's like a 2-hour drive from the town of Roswell. It's actually, the town itself actually has no connection to the crash beyond the fact that that was the nearest military base, and the wreckage was taken back to the base. But it literally is, like a 2-hour drive to get there from the town, and that's important for a reason that I'll come to now. The wreckage itself was first found and recovered by a man named Matt Brazel, who was a rancher who ran the Foster Ranch, this gigantic ranch in Lincoln County. And I went out there in 2010, and it's huge. It's like never ending. And he found all this wreckage strewn across the fields, which was described as like a type of foil, very lightweight. You could wad it up in your hands and it would bounce back to its original form without any marks or creases on it. Well, clearly clearly realizing that this wasn't something normal, he contacted the local sheriff's office. They in turn contacted the military, and the military came out. Now, as I said, today it's like a 2-hour drive. Back then, it was hours and hours to get out there, and when you were out there, you were forced to stay out there overnight because getting back up on the dirt roads was too treacherous. And there are rumours that in between the military having been called out and actually arriving, that Brazel sort of wandered around this entire crash site, and kind of like with an airplane crash, if it explodes in the air, different things come down at different sites. And reportedly, as well as this huge field of wreckage, there were a number of bodies scattered around the area, dead alien bodies, sort of pulverized and starting to decompose. And the story is that at one point, at least, Brazel's son, Vern Brazel, was also with him. Very much just like a young kid at the time, like 8 or 9, I think. But there have been a lot of rumours that he saw the bodies and it sort of really psychologically scarred him, put him into like a state of almost like post-traumatic stress, or if not full-blown post-traumatic stress. And he never reportedly got over this. And when he was about 16, 17, old enough to leave home, he left home immediately, never came back to New Mexico or Lincoln County, and actually blew his brains out in California when he was like 23. There was nothing suspicious in the sense of that he was murdered, but it is sort of possibly an example of an unusual death in relation to the crash. Now, a far more sinister one involves a woman named Miriam Bush. Miriam Bush was the executive secretary at the Roswell Military Hospital at the time of the events, and there have been a lot of stories about when the crash happened that the hospital played a significant role when the bodies were brought in. And much of this story surfaced in 1989 originally from a guy named Glenn Dennis. And Glenn Dennis was the mortician's assistant, at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in 47. And, back then it was just a small town. It's not that big today. And everybody knew him, And he got a call on one occasion right around the time of the